Hi, I'm Saran Fox.
I'm Dan Watanabe.
And this is Dan and
Saran,
Saran Take on Hollywood. And today we have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about Elizabeth Taylor, her many marriages, and how she changed sexual mores in this country.
And I'm going to add to that the fact that this was all done in the creation of a great commercial empire and how she was able, in that paleo era of publicity, to figure out how to monetize her private life into box office success in a way that would have made today's Kim Kardashian green with envy.
And look like a piker, an amateur. Yes. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So Elizabeth Taylor was born in England and came here at a very young age with her parents. She was a startlingly beautiful child with a set of double eyelashes and these startling, these violet blue eyes. If you look at pictures of her, you can't take your eyes off of her. The first movie she made...
There's One Born Every Minute.
One Born Every Minute. And there was something, the camera loved her, even as a child.
And ironically, she was actually up for the role of Bonnie in Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
In the very beginning. It would have been very ironic if she had played that part, because later on in her life, she would replace Vivien Leigh in Elephant Walk.
Oh, that's interesting. And she was only 7 years old at that time. Mm-hmm. She made her first big movie, National Velvet, with Mickey Rooney, where she played a woman who loved her horse Velvet and raced it in a steeplechase in England. Mickey Rooney played the groom. So as she blossomed into young adulthood, she was in a movie called Cynthia. She wrote a book about her squirrel Nibbles.
Nibbles and Me.
Nibbles and Me. She loved horses. She had a stage mother, Frances.
Sarah.
And her father was Francis, I think.
I don't
She had a brother
remember
was Howard.
Mm-hmm.
I read all those movie magazines faithfully.
But what was really important about her is even from an early age, because of the way she looked, she was able to attract men to her. She was a moth to the, they were like moths to the flame. And her first husband was Nicky Hilton.
Nicky Hilton. He was the heir to the Hilton fortune. He was a ne'er-do-well gambling alcoholic. They had a big wedding in the Episcopalian Church on Big Santa Monica in Beverly Hills, for those of you who live in the Los Angeles area. She was 1950, so she was 18 years old when she married him. They went on a honeymoon, and the marriage turned into a nightmare. He beat her, neglected her for his gambling activities, and she divorced him within the year, correct?
Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then she went, the next to is Michael Wilding. But all this time, who was a British actor, much older than her, and all this time, little by little, the movie magazines couldn't get enough of her. Mm-hmm. And in that process, they realized that here you had someone who was manufacturing her own publicity. She could just walk outside and cause a public panic.
All she had to do was show interest in a man, and it was all over.
And it was all over.
The movie magazines. And then she made An American in Paris in 1953 with Van Johnson. Remember that? Robert Taylor?
Last Time I Saw Paris.
Oh, Last Time I Saw Paris, yes.
Before that, though, she did A Place in the Sun.
Yes.
A Place in the Sun with Montgomery Clift. And from that moment on, Elizabeth Taylor became one of Hollywood's first champions of the pink palace, so to speak, the gay underside of Hollywood, right. Because she was one of the first actresses who never went as far as to marry a gay man deliberately in order for publicity to be kept quiet, like so many other stars that we know of and maybe we'll one day discuss. But she became a champion of someone like Montgomery Clift, making sure that after he had his really almost fatal auto accident, that she would not allow him to be fired off of a set. In Suddenly Last Summer, she made sure when Joseph L. Mankiewicz was hot to fire him that she stepped in and made sure that didn't happen.
And she did run into trouble in the movie that she made with Houston with Marlon Brando. I'm not remembering the name.
Reflections in a Golden Eye.
Reflections in a Golden Eye. She wanted Clift to play that role, and they wouldn't insure him, so she failed at that. She also was a very gutsy, down-to-earth broad when Montgomery Clift was also, if you look at the film and the photos of them, the erotic nature. There's one photo, a black and white, where she has her head up and he has his head against her neck. It's very, very erotic. And people can say, well, he was gay and it's called acting. They were almost twin-like in their beauty. Before he had his accident, he was absolutely stunning. He had similar kind of eyes. He had the dark hair. They were best friends, and she was his champion. They worked very, very well together. In Raintree County, the first half of the movie, or whatever was shot before his accident, he lost his beauty. I don't know if plastic surgeons today would have done a better job.
They probably would have.
But here's the story. This is a very interesting story. She lived in Coldwater Canyon or Benedict Canyon?
I think Benedict Canyon.
She lived in Benedict Canyon with Michael Wilding, with whom she already had 2 sons. This was in 1957. So they had a party on a Saturday night. Kevin McCarthy was there, and they guess they didn't realize how drunk Clift was, but he was pretty drunk when he left, and he had a terrible, terrible accident where he crashed into a tree, and they heard the sound, and she came running out of the house, opened the door to the car, and his teeth went down his throat, and she pulled them out and saved him from choking on his own teeth. This is the kind of woman she was. I mean, she could step up to the plate during a crisis. She divorced Michael Wilding when she met Broadway producer and impresario Mike Todd. Short, not ugly, just a short Jewish guy with a lot of energy and willing to take a risk. But he had a lot of charisma and a lot of sexual attraction for her. He was older than her. He was in his 40s, and she was like 24, something like
Yes.
that. And there is a legend that he pursued her. They slept together, and afterwards he said to her, from now on you will F no one but me. And whether it's true or not, it's kind of an awesome thing for a man to say to a woman,
And then he was killed in a plane crash.
And she was supposed to go with him, but she had the flu. This was in March of '58. He was flying to New York, and New Mexico, I think it was, Arizona, New Mexico, the plane crashed. She went into deep mourning. There are photos of her all in black with the veil at the funeral. And then within a week or two, she went back to work on Cat in a Hot Tin Roof. And then took up with his best friend, Eddie Fisher, who was married to America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds.
And this is where the legend of how Elizabeth Taylor changed American values begins. She went out with Eddie Fisher, and for a moment, everyone was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? But publicity people in Hollywood at that time were every bit as cynical as the worst internet impresario would be today.
Right.
And they saw an opportunity because Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher had a problem. And that problem was that their marriage wasn't working. Now, this was the old studio system. And under the old studio system, you weren't allowed to do anything without the studio's okay. And the studio had already pictured Debbie and Eddie as this ideal couple, bundle of joy, blah, 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 movies that are unwatchable today other than for their camp appeal.
Right.
But all of a sudden, here comes this evil siren.
She was the Scarlet Woman, and Debbie was America's sweetheart, a woman scorned.
And Liz stole Eddie, and they got married. And this was the greatest publicity stunt ever in Hollywood history, next to the casting of Scarlett O'Hara.
And you have to understand, back in the late 50s, there was no internet. There were 3 channels on television. There were newspapers and movie magazines, and they had a field day with this. The publicity machine was working overtime, making Liz the Scarlet Woman and Debbie the woman scorned, when in truth, Debbie and Eddie had their problems in the bedroom and out of the bedroom.
They stayed married, and so this actually solved 2 problems at once. So what did the studios do with Debbie? They put her in a movie called Tammy and the Bachelor,
Right.
which turned out to be one of her biggest successes.
With a very big hit song.
A very, very big hit song. Meanwhile, Liz's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof went through the roof. Yes, you had church groups saying, this is a Scarlet Woman.
Right.
This is a major sinner. And guess what? The publicity drove that movie into being such a success.
And they were smart enough to put the photograph on the poster of her in a white slip.
Yes.
And showing a little bit of bust and her her tragic beauty. And so it went, and Paul Newman, and it went, and it did go through the roof.
Went through the roof. And then Elizabeth Taylor was offered the chance to do Cleopatra, which she didn't want to do it. She was kind of over Hollywood, and
Didn't
she
she
had
demand a lot of money and they paid her?
No, here's what happened. She thought it was a joke. Because remember, this time, making a couple $100,000 was considered big
of money.
money. So she said to them, "Oh, you know what? If you want to be in this movie, yeah, I'll do it. But I want $1 million." And they said yes.
Yeah.
So she had no choice at that point.
So-
but there was a problem, and that is that MGM still owned her contract for one more movie, and that was Butterfield 8, which she so didn't want to do. She goes, "This woman is a prostitute." And the producer, Hunt Stromberg, went and said, "Exactly." And because he knew what he was doing. Now, Elizabeth Taylor would never speak to him after this. But she made this movie and was able to go off to do Cleopatra.
She went to Rome to do Cleopatra, and when she was there, and Eddie came with her. Eddie trotted along after her because Eddie's singing career was on the rocks. He didn't have much of one anymore. And they had this very serious sexual connection because she had a very strong sex drive, and it was no secret. And on the set of Cleopatra, she meets...
No. We were missing an important part. Okay, now you have Elizabeth Taylor, Whore of Babylon personified, in England, where they're shooting Cleopatra, where it's raining all the time, and this is an exterior movie. And guess what? Elizabeth Taylor, not the healthiest person in the world.
Oh, she becomes ill. Oh, her tracheotomy.
She gets pneumonia,
She gets pneumonia,
and almost dies.
And they have to perform a tracheotomy on her. There is a photo of her being loaded into the ambulance to go to the hospital. She had to have a tracheotomy to save her life. And so this brought a lot of public opinion towards her because she survived.
She was forgiven overnight.
She was forgiven overnight. She went on to win the Academy Award for Butterfield 8, which was basically Hollywood saying, "We forgive you."
And made Shirley MacLaine her mortal enemy until they ended up making up with each other when they did These Old Broads.
Yes, and then on the set, she meets Richard Burton, who is married with 2 young daughters, and he played Mark Anthony, right?
He's going to be playing Mark Anthony.
And sparks flew. And so she started having an affair with her co-star, humiliating Eddie Fisher.
And this was 1961. And an Italian movie called La Dolce Vita had come out about the world of the paparazzi and that whole world of reporters. And this was an opportunity to take that word and add it into our lexicon because the paparazzis are the ones who got the initial pictures of Elizabeth Taylor on a boat making out.
Yeah.
And these were photos that went around the world, caused Spiros Skouras, who is running 20th Century Fox, to almost have a heart attack, and for everyone to go into massive panic because once again, here was Liz going after someone. Hedda Hopper even condemned her, and it looked like all was over, but the public loved it.
The public loved Burton and Taylor. They loved them together. Their passion was so evident, their love for each other, their connection. They fought like cats and dogs, and then they made up. And he was a brilliant actor who was also, could quote Dylan Thomas. He also was an alcoholic. Yeah.
So Cleopatra gets made, and rumor had it for a long time that Cleopatra was a box office failure. It actually wasn't. It was the biggest movie of 1963, which was not an inauspicious year. It just cost so much. It cost in today's dollars $800 million in an era without home video, without streaming services, without any real ancillary markets, with no cable. So imagine a movie today costing $800 million. How long would it take for that movie to break even? It ultimately did make money, and it ultimately today plays very, very well. But Burton and Taylor became Hollywood's favorite couple, and they were the precursors of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they didn't necessarily make movies that made money, but they kept the public interested in show business by their antics off camera.
Absolutely.
Didn't stop them from making an immortal classic, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
And that was a risk that Mike Nichols and his producers took. This was Nichols' first film that he directed, because he'd been a stage director, a theater director. And I don't know, did they want her?
They absolutely wanted her. And Edward Albee has never liked the movie. But what's important about this, again, is that Elizabeth Taylor was responsible for the destruction of the production code, because Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf violated almost every tenet of the production code, and Warner Brothers, based on her notoriety, based on the fact that she was going to be in this movie with Burton, that it was such a change of pace, made this adaptation of what's basically a chamber play into a clarion call for the end of the production code and censorship in films. With its 7 Bastards, 5 Sons of Bitches, 3 or 4 Goddams, and various other assorted explicitives that were scattered throughout it, you saw the production code go away. Now remember, the producer of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf had just the year before won all sorts of awards for The Sound of Music. So imagine that you have The Sound of Music followed the next year by Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
For those of you out there who haven't seen Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you'll need a nap afterwards. You'll walk out of there absolutely exhausted. What did you think of her performance? I thought she was good. She wasn't as good as he. He was a better actor than her. He was not the great movie star that she was. She transcended good acting. Because of all the movie stars that the camera loved, it loved her the most. Well, what did you think of her performance?
It doesn't matter, because her performance in it is the whole reason for that movie.
Yeah.
You can't take your eyes off of her.
Yeah.
She's tearing up the screen
Yeah.
all the way through it, and you're seeing star power at its height.
Absolutely.
Where even and why Edward Albee hated the movie is that his play was a chamber play, and it was a modernist play, and it was, not modernist, absurdist. And he never liked the fact that it was more or less street realistic. He felt it was a mistake. Plus, he didn't like Elizabeth Taylor in it. He felt she was too attractive. Excuse me, but that's the point of the movie.
Oh, they thought if they put some gray in her hair, that would make her look older. I guess his idea of Martha was Uta Hagen, who played her on the stage.
Yes, Martha was, obviously Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was about gay men who, you had to switch the genders, excuse me, in the stage and the screen of that day. But
how was it about gay men?
Oh, please. You have these two people who don't have a kid and who have a phony child that's all a fantasy, and they have this couple come over, a heterosexual couple come over, and one of them, the really ugly, blousy one, looks at this guy and says, "I'm going to sleep with you, and I'm going to because you're too interested in your career, and I'm going to prove that you're even worse than you think." And yeah, that happens in the movie. But when you see Elizabeth Taylor doing it, you're like, yeah, if I was George Segal, I'd look at her and go, I got my choice, Sandy Dennis or Liz Taylor. Which am I going to choose?
There you go.
There you go. So Elizabeth Taylor, in her runaway with Eddie Fisher, caused the Pope to condemn her, the public to wait until she had actually recovered from pneumonia to say she was cool. After she and Elizabeth Taylor ran out, not so much. In fact, marriage mores changed overnight.
I think the public overlooked the fact that it broke up 2 marriages, and she had 2 young sons with Michael Wilding, and a daughter with Michael Todd, and the fact that Burton had a very loyal wife, Sybil Christopher, and she married someone else afterwards, and 2 young daughters, one of whom was handicapped. We were in love with their love and their passion. They made a number of not so great but fun movies like The Sandpiper and Boom, and he made a wonderful movie, another Tennessee Williams, Night of the Iguana, in Mexico, which is really a very fine film. A lot of he drank a lot, and they both drank a lot, and they fought. He had a sense that he had betrayed his gift.
Yes.
And a lot of other actors felt the same way about him, that he had betrayed his gift for money because they made a ton of money, and he was always buying her diamonds, and they were always fighting. And eventually, in like 1972 or 73 or 74, they divorced finally. And then they remarried about 2 years later for about 6 months or a year, and had a second divorce. And she had 8 marriages to 7 men, and we can list them. Nicky Hilton, Michael Wilding, Mike Todd, Eddie Fisher, Richard Burton, Senator John Warner, and a guy named Larry Fortensky. That was her last husband. She didn't like to be alone, and she liked to be married.
Yes.
And she was a senator's wife for a while. She put on a lot of weight. She lived in Washington, tried to take on that life, and in her later years, she was always sick. She had a thing, and I always had a theory that this was a way to get attention. And this was a way to get a genuine attention, that she would play weakness and have people take care of her. Because I think her mother may have seen her as a commodity, and of course, her public saw her as a commodity.
But remember, she was also tough from the time she was a kid.
Yeah.
There's a rumor, unsubstantiated, but probably, even if it's apocryphal, it makes sense, knowing what she became later. That Louis B. Mayer was kind of interested in her. Don't think pedophilia is new in Hollywood, by the way. And he had actually wanted her to sit on his lap. And she said, well, F you, Mr. Mayer, and stormed out. And fortunately, her parents had enough money to where they weren't able to be beholden. And Mayer backed down to this 15-year-old kid.
Because she was a valuable commodity.
And this was before right around the time of National Velvet. And she was able to do
and
it.
here's a I don't want to say a lesson, but here's something we all can take from this, is she was a competent actress. Obviously, she could say lines, she could hit her mark, the camera loved her. It didn't matter what kind of an actress she was. There was a romance about her, there was an anger about her, a sense, like all the great ones, there was this sense of she could explode at any moment, which she did quite often. The great ones hold a mystery. They're very compelling. We're wondering what's going on underneath that. Plus, she was this incredible beauty with that little voice. And there's that scene in Place in the Sun where she's with Montgomery Clift, and they're embracing. They're in a passionate embrace, and she says, "Come to Mama, come to Mama." And she was what?
Tell Mama.
Tell Mama.
all.
She was 20 years old, maybe?
18.
18. She was older than her years. She just and then of course she made a great deal of money with her jewelry. Didn't she have jewelry and perfume?
Jewelry and
the
she
Estee Lauder.
donated it almost all to AIDS because
research.
she was the one who really pushed it after Rock Hudson died.
Yeah, absolutely. So she was a tough broad. And here's an aside. I met her, one of the Wilding sons, at a friend's wedding. They were friends, and it's always so interesting when you're in the presence of Hollywood greatness, even though it's by birth, because he looked like both his parents, but he had those eyes, and it was so hard just speaking to him in general, not to say something to him, but saying, I am in the presence of Elizabeth Taylor's son, and he's a real person. And that's always an interesting thing when you meet people who you've seen on the screen or you know about their lives. She's one of the great ones. She's one of the great ones. You don't have to have a huge bundle of talent to make it in this town. You have to have that special something, and she had it. And she had a sexuality that she wasn't afraid to show, like the character of Maggie in A Hot Tin Roof was out there with her sexuality, and her gay husband, right?
Well,
who wouldn't sleep with her.
Gloria Wondrous in Butterfield 8.
Yeah.
And Liz Taylor was never shy about using her own life to be part of the box office success of her films.
Yep. And one more thing. In 1976, my late husband and I had tickets through a friend to the Oscars, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. And we went down there early. And this was in the days before all the paparazzi and all of that. And she was there with maybe her agent or her PR person. And I was like 5 months pregnant with my oldest child. And I loved her, and my husband in his tuxedo, we were there, and she was off like maybe 20 feet away, and he kept pushing me to get closer. And he said, "You're pregnant, nobody's gonna bother you." And he kept pushing me to say, "Go look at her, go look at her." So I got close enough, and she had a deep tan, and she was wearing a strapless like chiffon dress that was like red and orange, all pink, all mixed together. And her eyes, she had those violet eyes and those eyelashes. And I just stood there absolutely transfixed. I had no illusions. I was just in the presence of film greatness. That these people invade our dreams when we sit in the movies and watch them. And we like to talk together about our different viewpoints, that this woman's box office success was based upon her life, and she invaded my dreams on a regular basis and that of the public. She's gone now. She was quite ill at the end of her life, but she lives on Turner Classic Movies. So tune into a Liz Taylor movie. You won't regret it.
Okay.
This is it for us for this episode of Dan and Saran Take on Hollywood. I'm Saran Fox.
Dan Watanabe.
And like and subscribe to the Unscripted Network, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.